On the night of November 8th, 1923, approximately 3,000 people had gathered in the Bürgerbräuzer, a cavernous beer hall on the outskirts of Munich. They had come to hear speeches from Bavaria's political leadership, State Commissioner Gustav von Kahr, General Otto von Lossow, and Police Chief Hans Ritter von Seser, men who represented conservative authority in a Germany that seemed to be falling apart. Outside, autumn rain fell on cobblestone streets. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke, the smell of beer, and the murmur of anxious conversation about the state of the nation. At approximately 8:30 p.m., the murmur became a roar. The doors burst open, and armed men in brown shirts poured into the hall. At their head strode a 34-year-old man with a small mustache and wild, staring eyes. He was dressed in a black morning coat, looking almost respectable, except for the pistol he brandished above his head. He climbed onto a chair, fired a shot into the ceiling, and in the sudden silence that followed, shouted, "The National Revolution has begun." This hall is surrounded by 600 heavily armed men. No one may leave. The Bavarian and Reich governments have been deposed. A new national government will be formed this very day in Munich. The man's name was Adolf Hitler. He was the leader of a small extremist party called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. He was attempting what he believed would be the first step in a march on Berlin, modeled on Mussolini's successful march on Rome a year earlier. Within 16 hours, his putsch would collapse in a hail of police gunfire. Within 16 months, he would be released from prison, having written a book that outlined his vision for Germany's future. Within 10 years, he would be Chancellor of Germany. But on that rainy November night, Hitler was a failed revolutionary, a beer hall agitator whose grandiose dreams seemed to have ended in farce. The police had dispersed his march. 16 of his followers lay dead in the streets of Munich. He had fled, hiding in a supporter's attic until his arrest 2 days later. The putsch that was supposed to begin the national revolution had accomplished nothing, or so it seemed. History would judge differently. The Beer Hall Putsch failed as a coup, but succeeded as propaganda. Hitler's trial gave him a national platform. His imprisonment gave him time to write Mein Kampf. His legend as a martyr who had risked everything for Germany was born. The failure of 1923 laid the groundwork for the success of 1933. The story of the Beer Hall Putsch is the story of Weimar Germany in microcosm, a democracy born in crisis, threatened from left and right, struggling to survive against enemies who would stop at nothing to destroy it. For 14 years, from its birth in the chaos of defeat to its death in the shadow of dictatorship, the Weimar Republic would fight for its existence. It would produce some of the most vibrant cultures in European history. It would pioneer social democracy and progressive legislation. It would struggle towards stability and international respectability. And in the end, it would fall, not conquered from without, but betrayed from within, its enemies more ruthless and more determined than its defenders. This is the story of Germany's first democracy and how it was destroyed. Of idealists who believed that Germany could be transformed from an authoritarian empire into a liberal republic. Of extremists who believed that democracy was a weakness and that only violent revolution of the left or the right could save Germany from its enemies. Of ordinary Germans who lived through economic catastrophe, political violence, and social upheaval, trying to make sense of a world that seemed to have lost all stability. This is the story of the Weimar tragedy. The Weimar Republic was born in defeat, revolution, and chaos. It inherited the ruins of an empire that had seemed invincible only months before. On November 9th, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. Germany was in turmoil. Sailors had mutinied at Kiel. Workers' and soldiers' councils, Soviets, modeled on the Russian example, were forming in cities across Germany. Revolutionary socialists were demanding the overthrow of the capitalist order. The army was exhausted, demoralized, and streaming home from the front. The old order had collapsed, and no one knew what would replace it. Into this vacuum stepped Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the Social Democratic Party, SPD. Ebert was 57 years old, a saddler's son who had risen through the ranks of the labor movement to become one of Germany's most prominent politicians. He was not a revolutionary, He believed in gradual reform and parliamentary democracy and working within the system to achieve change. When the Kaiser's government collapsed, Ebert found himself unexpectedly at the head of a provisional government with no clear mandate and no means of enforcing its authority. Ebert faced an impossible situation. On his left were the radical socialists, the Spartacists led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, and the independent Social Democrats who had split from the SPD over the war, demanding immediate socialization of industry, workers' control, and a republic of councils rather than a parliamentary democracy. On his right were the remnants of the old order, the army, the civil service, the industrialists, the conservative parties, who despised the revolution and would accept a republic only as a temporary expedient until the monarchy could be restored. Ebert chose to align with the right against the left. On November 10th, the day after the Kaiser's abdication, Ebert received a telephone call from General Wilhelm Groener, the effective head of the German army. Groener offered a deal. The army would support the provisional government if the government would maintain military discipline, resist radical revolution, and allow the army to return home in good order. Ebert accepted. The Ebert-Groener Pact, as it came to be known, preserved the power of the army and set the pattern for the Weimar Republic's relationship with its military, an armed force that tolerated democracy but never truly accepted it. The consequences of this choice became apparent almost immediately. In December 1918, revolutionary sailors occupied the Imperial Palace in Berlin and demanded radical change. Ebert's government called in the army to restore order. Fighting broke out. The military's heavy-handed suppression of the sailors alienated the left and established a pattern of using force against workers that would recur throughout the Weimar period. The decisive confrontation came in January 1919. The Spartacists, who had reorganized as the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, launched an uprising in Berlin. They seized newspaper offices, called for a general strike, and demanded the overthrow of the Ebert government. The uprising was poorly planned and had little popular support, but it terrified the government and the middle classes, who saw it as the beginning of a German Bolshevik revolution. Ebert's government turned to a new force to suppress the uprising, the Freikorps. These were volunteer military units composed largely of demobilized soldiers who could not or would not return to civilian life. Many were hardened veterans of the trenches, men who had been brutalized by 4 years of war and who saw in the chaos of post-war Germany an opportunity to continue fighting. They were armed, organized, and filled with hatred of the revolution, hatred of the Reds, hatred of democracy, hatred of the republic that had emerged from Germany's defeat. The Freikorps crushed the Spartacist uprising with extreme violence. The fighting in Berlin lasted a week and left hundreds dead. On January 15, 1919, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were captured by Freikorps soldiers. They were beaten, shot, and their bodies dumped. Liebknecht in the Tiergarten, Luxemburg in the Landwehr Canal, where her corpse was not recovered for months. The murders were never properly investigated, and the perpetrators were given light sentences or allowed to escape. Aimed at the killing of Luxemburg and Liebknecht established the pattern of political violence that would characterize the Weimar Republic. The far left saw the government as murderers who had betrayed the revolution. The far right saw the Freikorps as heroes who had saved Germany from Bolshevism. And the Democratic Center found itself caught between two forces that regarded democracy itself as the enemy. While Berlin burned, elections were held for a National Assembly that would draft a new constitution. The elections of January 19, 1919 were the first in German history in which women could vote, a revolutionary change that the SPD had long advocated. The turnout was massive. Over 30 million Germans voted, representing 83% of eligible voters. The results gave a mandate to the moderate parties. The SPD won the largest share of the vote, 37.9%, but fell short of a majority. The Catholic Center Party and the German Democratic Party, DDP, a liberal party, together won another third of the vote. The three parties formed a coalition government, the Weimar Coalition, that would draft the Constitution and lead the Republic through its early years. The National Assembly met not in Berlin, which was still racked by violence, But in Weimar, a small city in Thuringia best known as the home of Goethe and Schiller, the giants of German literature, the choice was symbolic. Germany would build its new democracy on the foundations of its cultural heritage, not its military traditions. The new republic would forever be associated with the city where its constitution was drafted. The Weimar Constitution, adopted in August 1919, was one of the most progressive constitutions of its era. It established a federal republic with a bicameral legislature, the Reichstag directly elected by proportional representation, and the Reichsrat representing the German states. The Reich president was directly elected for a 7-year term and served as head of state. The Reich chancellor was head of government, appointed by the president but responsible to the Reichstag. Civil liberties were guaranteed: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. Social rights were enshrined: the right to education, the right to work, and the protection of labor. But the Constitution also contained provisions that would prove fatal. Article 48 gave the president emergency powers to suspend civil liberties and rule by decree if public security and order are seriously disturbed or endangered. This provision was intended as a safety valve for crises, but it would be used repeatedly to circumvent the Reichstag, and in the end, it would provide the mechanism for destroying democracy entirely. The proportional representation system, while fair in allocating seats according to votes received, made it almost impossible for any single party to win a majority. Coalition governments were the norm, and these coalitions were often unstable, requiring constant negotiation among parties with conflicting interests. In 14 years, the Weimar Republic would have 20 different cabinets, an average of one every 8 months. Friedrich Ebert was elected Reich president by the National Assembly. He would serve until his death in 1925, providing what stability he could to a republic that seemed perpetually on the brink of collapse. Ebert believed in democracy and the rule of law, in compromise and negotiation. But he was a practical politician, not a charismatic leader, and he could never inspire the passionate loyalty that the Republic's enemies inspired in their followers. The Republic's first years were consumed by crisis. The enemies of democracy were everywhere, and they were relentless. In March 1920, the Kapp Putsch demonstrated how fragile the government's hold on power truly was. Wolfgang Kapp was a right-wing politician who dreamed of restoring the monarchy and sweeping away the November criminals who had signed the armistice and accepted the Treaty of Versailles. Working with elements of the Freikorps, particularly the Erard Brigade, which was about to be disbanded under the treaty's disarmament provisions, Kapp planned a coup. On March 13, 1920, the Erard Brigade marched on Berlin. The government fled, first to Dresden, then to Stuttgart. When Defense Minister Gustav Nosk ordered the regular army to suppress the Putsch, General Hans von Seeckt, the commander of the Reichswehr, refused. "Troops do not fire on troops," Seeckt declared. The army would not defend the Republic against a right-wing coup. Kapp installed himself in the Reich Chancellery and proclaimed a new government. But he had no program beyond vague appeals to nationalism, and he had no idea how to actually govern. The bureaucracy refused to cooperate with him. The unions called a general strike that paralyzed the country. Within 5 days, the putsch collapsed and Kapp fled to Sweden. The Erard Brigade marched out of Berlin, firing into crowds of workers who jeered them as they left. The Kapp Putsch failed, but its lessons were ominous. The army would not defend the Republic against the right. The judiciary was equally unreliable. Participants in the putsch received lenient sentences or no punishment at all, while leftists who had resisted the coup were prosecuted. The Republic survived not because its institutions defended it, but because its enemies were incompetent. The failure of the Kapp Putsch triggered uprisings on the left. In the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, workers who had organized against the putsch refused to demobilize. They formed a Red Army of perhaps 50,000 men and demanded radical reforms. The government, which had been unable to suppress a right-wing coup, responded to the left-wing uprising with overwhelming force. The Reichswehr and the Freikorps were sent in. The fighting was brutal, and over 1,000 workers were killed. The pattern was clear. The Republic would tolerate challenges from the right, but would crush challenges from the left. This asymmetry would persist throughout the Weimar period, poisoning relations between the Social Democrats and the Communists and making any united front against the Nazis impossible. Political violence became endemic. Between 1919 and 1922, political murders claimed hundreds of lives. The victims were overwhelmingly from the left. The perpetrators were overwhelmingly from the right. The Organization Council, a terrorist group composed of former Freikorps members, carried out a campaign of assassination against politicians it deemed traitors. On August 26, 1921, Matthias Erzberger, the Center Party politician who had signed the armistice, was shot to death while walking in the Black Forest. On June 24, 1922, Walter Rathenau, the foreign minister, was machine-gunned in his car on the streets of Berlin. Both killings were carried out by Organization Council assassins. Rathenau's murder shocked Germany. He was not just a politician, but a prominent intellectual and industrialist, a man who represented the best of German culture. He was also Jewish, and his killers were motivated partly by anti-Semitism. The government responded with a law for the protection of the Republic, which banned extremist organizations and created special courts to try political crimes. But enforcement was lax, and the violence continued. The courts consistently favored right-wing defendants. A comprehensive study of political violence during the Weimar period found that courts sentenced left-wing offenders to an average of 15 years in prison, while sentencing right-wing offenders to an average of 4 months. Perpetrators of right-wing murders were acquitted or given minimal sentences. Perpetrators of left-wing violence were executed. This judicial bias reflected the attitudes of the judges themselves. Most had been appointed under the Kaiser and had never accepted the legitimacy of the Republic. They saw left-wing violence as an assault on the social order and right-wing violence as a misguided expression of patriotism. Their rulings taught a clear lesson. The state would protect those who attacked democracy from the right, but would punish those who attacked it from the left. The political crisis was compounded by economic catastrophe. The hyperinflation of 1922 to 1923 destroyed the German economy and traumatized an entire generation. The origins of the inflation lay in how Germany had financed the war. Rather than raising taxes, the imperial government had borrowed heavily, assuming that victory would allow it to impose reparations on the defeated enemy and pay off its debts. Defeat meant that the debts remained, compounded by the reparations obligations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. The immediate trigger for hyperinflation was the Ruhr occupation. In January 1923, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, claiming that Germany had defaulted on reparations payments. The German government responded with passive resistance. Workers refused to cooperate with the occupation, and the government continued to pay their wages. But since the Ruhr's industries were paralyzed, no goods were being produced. The government was paying wages with money that had no corresponding production behind it. The result was hyperinflation on a scale unprecedented in modern history. The government printed money to pay its obligations. The more money in circulation, the less each unit was worth. Prices rose accordingly. The more prices rose, the more money the government had to print. A vicious cycle spiraled out of control. The statistics are almost incomprehensible. In January 1921, $1 was worth approximately 65 marks. By January 1922, it was worth 191 marks. By January 1923, it was worth 17,972 marks. By July 1923, it was worth 353,000 marks. By August, it was worth 4.6 million marks. By November, at the height of the crisis, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. Prices doubled every few hours. Workers were paid twice a day, at noon and in the evening, so they could spend their wages before they became worthless. People carried money in wheelbarrows. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. A restaurant meal cost more by the time you finish eating than when you ordered. The savings of a lifetime could not buy a newspaper. The human cost was devastating. Everyone with fixed incomes, pensioners, civil servants, the middle class, saw their savings wiped out. A family that had carefully accumulated a nest egg over decades found it worthless overnight. A widow living on her husband's pension found she could not afford food. The social contract had been shattered. One German woman later recalled the experience. "We used to collect our wages in laundry baskets. Then we would rush to the shops to buy anything at all, before the prices went up again. I remember buying a piano that we did not need because at least it was something solid. The next day, the same piano cost 10 times as much. People burned money in their stoves because it was cheaper than buying wood." My grandmother's life savings, money she had put away over 50 years, could not buy a single loaf of bread. She died that winter of hunger and a broken heart. A German professor recounted, "I had saved for 20 years to buy a house. By the time the inflation ended, my savings were worth exactly enough to buy a box of matches. 20 years of careful living, of denying myself pleasures, of putting money aside for the future, gone. And I was one of the fortunate ones. I had my position at the university." Many of my colleagues who had retired on their pensions simply starved. The psychological impact was as devastating as the economic impact. Germans learned that money was meaningless, that the future was unpredictable, that everything could be taken away overnight. The middle class, the foundation of any stable democracy, felt betrayed by the republic that had allowed this to happen. Many concluded that democracy meant chaos, that only a strong leader could restore order. It was in this atmosphere of crisis that Adolf Hitler launched his Beer Hall Putsch. Hitler had emerged from the war as one of millions of bitter, displaced veterans. He had served as a corporal in the Bavarian army, had been wounded, and had been gassed. When the armistice came, he was recovering in a military hospital. Like many veterans, he could not accept that Germany had lost. The stab-in-the-back myth, the belief that Germany had been betrayed by Jews, socialists, and defeatists on the home front, became the foundation of his political worldview. After the war, Hitler remained in the army, working as an informant monitoring extremist political groups. In September 1919, he was assigned to investigate a tiny organization called the German Workers' Party, DAP. Instead of reporting on it, he joined it. Within 2 years, he had transformed it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, and had established himself as its undisputed leader. Hitler's political genius was his ability as a speaker. He could hold audiences spellbound for hours, building from a quiet, almost conversational opening to a crescendo of passion that left his listeners shaking with emotion. He spoke to German grievances, the humiliation of Versailles, the stab in the back, the economic chaos, the weakness of the Republic, and promised a Germany reborn, purged of its enemies, restored to greatness. His message was simple and powerful. Germany's problems were caused by Jews, Marxists, and traitors, and only the Nazis could save Germany from destruction. By 1923, the Nazi Party had grown to perhaps 55,000 members, concentrated largely in Bavaria. Hitler had surrounded himself with men who shared his vision. Hermann Göring, a war hero and flying ace. Ernst Röhm, an army officer who had helped arm the Nazis. Rudolf Hess, a devoted follower who worshipped Hitler as a messiah. Julius Streicher, a vicious anti-Semite who published a newspaper devoted to hatred of Jews. Together they dreamed of seizing power and remaking Germany. The hyperinflation crisis seemed to offer the perfect opportunity. Germany was in chaos. The government seemed paralyzed. Mussolini had marched on Rome and seized power in Italy just a year earlier. Why could Hitler not march on Berlin? The plan was to start in Bavaria, secure the support of the Bavarian government and military, and then march on Berlin with the Bavarian forces as the nucleus of a national revolution. The key was persuading the Bavarian leadership, State Commissioner Karl, General Lasso, and Police Chief Sacer to join the putsch. They had made sympathetic noises about opposing Berlin, but they were cautious men who would not act without assurances of success. Hitler decided to force their hand. On the night of November 8th, when all three leaders would be together at the Bürgerbräukeller, Hitler would seize them and demand their support. With armed Psyche men surrounding the beer hall, they would have no choice but to agree. The putsch began as planned. Hitler burst into the hall, fired his pistol into the ceiling and announced the revolution. He herded the three Bavarian leaders into a side room and, through a combination of threats and promises, extracted their agreement to support him. General Erich Ludendorff, the war hero who had joined Hitler's cause, arrived to lend his prestige to the enterprise. The coup seemed to be succeeding, but Hitler made a critical error. He left the beer hall to deal with the crisis elsewhere, leaving the three Bavarian leaders under guard. In his absence, they were allowed to leave after promising to support the putsch. Once free, they immediately repudiated their promises and began organizing resistance. By morning, the putsch was unraveling. The army remained loyal to the government. The police were preparing to suppress the uprising. Hitler's followers, who had been told that the Bavarian authorities were on their side, were confused and demoralized. In desperation, Hitler decided to march. Perhaps a show of force would rally support. Perhaps the police would not fire on Ludendorff, a national hero. Perhaps something would turn up. At noon on November 9th, the 5th anniversary of the Kaiser's abdication, Hitler, Ludendorff, and approximately 2,000 followers marched through the streets of Munich toward the center of the city. They got as far as the Feldherrnhalle, a memorial hall dedicated to Bavarian military heroes. There, they found their way blocked by a police cordon. Someone fired. It was never established who, and a chaotic firefight erupted. The police opened fire on the marchers. Hitler either threw himself to the ground or was pulled down by the man next to him, dislocating his shoulder. Goering was shot in the groin. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed. The march dissolved in panic as the survivors fled. Hitler escaped in a car, nursing his injured shoulder. He was arrested 2 days later at the home of Ernst Hanfstiengel, a Harvard-educated supporter who had provided a hiding place. He was charged with treason and faced a possible death sentence. The Putsch failed utterly. Hitler's dream of marching on Berlin had ended in a bloodbath. The Nazi Party was banned. Its leaders were imprisoned or in hiding. It seemed to be finished. But Hitler's trial transformed a failure into a triumph. The trial was held in Munich before sympathetic Bavarian judges who gave Hitler extraordinary latitude to turn the proceedings into a political platform. Rather than defending himself against the charges, Hitler attacked the Republic. He admitted attempting to overthrow the government, but argued that the real criminals were the November criminals who had signed the armistice and accepted Versailles. He was not a traitor. He was a patriot trying to save Germany from traitors. Hitler's speeches at the trial were extensively covered by the press. For the first time, he had a national audience. His message of grievance and revenge resonated with millions who shared his bitterness. His willingness to accept responsibility for his actions, while insisting that his actions were justified, won him admirers. He became a national figure, a martyr for the cause of German nationalism. The verdict was a travesty. Hitler was found guilty of treason, but sentenced to only 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 6 months. The lenient sentence reflected the court's sympathy for his motives. The judgment explicitly stated that Hitler had been motivated by a pure patriotic spirit and the most honorable intentions. Ludendorff was acquitted entirely. Hitler served his sentence at Landsberg prison, where he was treated more like a guest than a convict. He had a comfortable cell with a view of the garden. He received visitors, held political discussions, and dictated the manuscript that would become Mein Kampf to Rudolf Hess, who had voluntarily joined him in prison. Mein Kampf, My Struggle, was part autobiography, part political manifesto. It laid out Hitler's worldview in rambling, often incoherent prose. The centrality of race to history, the struggle between Aryans and Jews, the need for living space, Lebensraum in the East, the destruction of Bolshevism, the reversal of Versailles, and the creation of a greater German Reich. The book was tedious and difficult to read, but it sold well enough to make Hitler financially independent. More importantly, Mein Kampf revealed Hitler's intentions to anyone who cared to pay attention. He made clear that he intended to destroy the Jews, to conquer territory in the East, and to build an empire that would dominate Europe. His program was not hidden. It was published for anyone to read. Few took it seriously. It was dismissed as the ravings of a failed politician, not a blueprint for the future. Hitler was released from prison on December 20th, 1924, having served just over a year. The Nazi Party had been banned in his absence, and he faced restrictions on public speaking in most German states. The hyperinflation crisis had been resolved, and Germany was entering a period of relative stability. Many believed that Hitler's moment had passed, that he was a relic of the chaotic post-war years who had no place in a stabilizing Germany. They could not have been more wrong. The man who stabilized Germany and gave the Weimar Republic its brief golden 20s was Gustav Stresemann. Stresemann had been a fervent nationalist during the war, supporting German expansion and annexation, but defeat and revolution had taught him pragmatism. He recognized that Germany could not fight the world, that it had to work within the international system to recover its strength. He became the leading advocate of fulfillment, accepting the treaty obligations while working to revise them through negotiation rather than confrontation. Stresemann served briefly as chancellor in 1923 during the worst of the hyperinflation crisis. His government ended the passive resistance in the Ruhr, which was costing Germany far more than the French occupation. He introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed by German land and industrial assets rather than gold. The psychological effect was immediate. Germans believed in the new currency, and the hyperinflation ended almost overnight. The stabilization was imperfect, and many people's savings remained worthless, but at least prices stopped rising. After his brief chancellorship, Stresemann served as foreign minister from 1923 until he died in 1929. In this role, he transformed Germany's international position through a series of diplomatic achievements. The Dawes Plan of 1924 restructured German reparations payments into manageable amounts backed by American loans. The plan did not reduce the total amount Germany owed. That remained to be determined, but it made the payment sustainable and restored confidence in the German economy. American money flowed into Germany, funding reconstruction and industrial expansion. The German economy began to grow. The Locarno Treaties of 1925 were Stresemann's masterpiece. Germany voluntarily accepted its western borders with France and Belgium, renouncing any claim to Alsace-Lorraine. In exchange, Germany was accepted back into the community of nations. The Rhineland would be evacuated ahead of schedule. Germany would be admitted to the League of Nations. The atmosphere of confrontation that had characterized Franco-German relations since the war began to ease. Stresemann won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1926, sharing it with his French counterpart Aristide Briand. The two men, who had been enemies during the war, worked together to build what they hoped would be a lasting peace. They spoke of European cooperation, of transcending national rivalries, of building a future based on partnership rather than conflict. The Locarno spirit, as it was called, represented the high point of Weimar foreign policy. Germany was no longer an outcast but an accepted member of the international community. The spirit of Locarno suggested that the wounds of the war might heal, that Europe might move beyond the hatreds of the past. But the Locarno Treaties had a significant limitation. Quote, Stresemann accepted Germany's western borders, but he made no such commitment regarding the east. Poland and Czechoslovakia were not covered by Locarno's guarantees. Stresemann's acceptance of the western settlement was genuine. His acceptance of the eastern settlement was tactical. He still hoped to revise Germany's eastern borders to recover the Polish corridor and the territories lost to Poland and Czechoslovakia. He simply intended to do so through negotiation rather than war. This distinction would prove critical. When Hitler came to power, he would exploit the same logic, except the West revised the East. The difference was that Hitler intended to revise the East through conquest, not negotiation. The years from 1924 to 1929, the Golden Twenties, were the Weimar Republic's best years, though golden was an exaggeration. Economically, Germany recovered remarkably. Industrial production exceeded pre-war levels. Unemployment fell. Wages rose. Consumer goods that had been unimaginable during the war and inflation years became available again. American loans and investments poured in, funding new factories, new housing, and new infrastructure. Berlin became a boomtown, growing into one of Europe's largest and most dynamic cities. Culturally, Weimar Germany was one of the most creative societies in history. Berlin became the capital of the avant-garde, attracting artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals from across Europe. Expressionism, Dadaism, and the new objectivity flourished. The Bauhaus school revolutionized architecture and design. Fritz Lang made Metropolis. F.W. Murnau made Nosferatu and Sunrise. Bertolt Brecht and Kurd created the Three-Penny Opera. Thomas Mann won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Albert Einstein had already revolutionized physics and was now a global celebrity. Berlin's cabaret scene offered entertainment that was sophisticated, satirical, and sexually liberated in ways that shocked conservatives and delighted moderns. Weimar culture was cosmopolitan, experimental, and often decadent. It celebrated individual freedom, challenged traditional morality, and explored the boundaries of art and expression. It was also deeply unsettling to many Germans who saw it as a symptom of national decline. The cabarets, the jazz clubs, the openly gay bars, the provocative art, all this represented to conservative Germans the collapse of values and the corruption of German culture by foreign, often Jewish in their view, influences. The cultural divide between modernizers and traditionalists reflected deeper political divisions. The Weimar Republic had supporters, the parties of the Weimar Coalition, the intellectuals, the cosmopolitan urbanites, but it also had enemies who despised everything it represented. To them, Weimar culture was not liberation but degeneration, not creativity but corruption. They would burn the books, close the cabarets, and drive the artists into exile or death. Politically, the Golden Twenties saw relative stability, but stability was relative. Coalition governments came and went with regularity. The Social Democrats, the largest party, were often excluded from government because bourgeois parties refused to work with them. The Communists, following Moscow's line, attacked the Social Democrats as social fascists rather than potential allies. The parties of the right, the German National People's Party, DNVP, and smaller nationalist groups accepted the Republic only tactically, waiting for an opportunity to destroy it. Friedrich Ebert died in February 1925, exhausted by the demands of the presidency and weakened by a burst appendix that he had neglected during a political crisis. The election to choose his successor was a disaster for the Republic. In the second round of voting, the nationalist parties united behind Paul von Hindenburg, the former field marshal who had commanded German forces in the latter part of the war. Hindenburg won, defeating the Center Party candidate Wilhelm Marx. Hindenburg was 87 years old, a relic of the old order who had never accepted the legitimacy of the Republic. He took his oath of office to defend the Constitution, but his loyalties remained with the monarchy and the military. He surrounded himself with advisors who despised democracy. He used the powers of the presidency to undermine governments he disliked. In the crisis of the early 1930s, he would appoint Hitler as chancellor, believing that the Nazis could be controlled. He was wrong, and his error destroyed the Republic. The Nazi Party, revived after Hitler's release from prison, remained a marginal force during the Golden Twenties. Hitler had learned from the failure of the putsch that power could not be seized through violence alone. It had to be won through elections, at least in part. He reorganized the party on a national basis, creating a structure that would be ready to compete for power when opportunity arose. The party appealed to the dispossessed and the resentful, veterans who could not adjust to civilian life, middle-class Germans who had lost everything in the inflation, young people who saw no future in a republic that seemed to offer them nothing. The Samentelung, or stormtroopers, provided a home for violent men who wanted to fight for something, anything. The party's message of grievance, hatred, and revenge resonated with those who felt themselves victims of Versailles, of democracy, of modernity. But in the stable conditions of the mid-1920s, the Nazis could not gain traction. In the Reichstag elections of May 1928, the party won only 2.6% of the vote and 12 seats, fewer than the Bavarian People's Party, a regional party of limited national significance. Hitler was banned from public speaking in most states, and his book sales were declining. Many observers concluded that the Nazi movement was finished. a relic of the chaotic post-war years that had no place in a modern, stable Germany. One American journalist visiting Germany in 1928 wrote, "Hitler and his National Socialists are finished. The Germans have turned away from extremism and embraced democracy. The Weimar Republic, despite its troubled birth, has become a stable and functioning democracy. The future belongs to the moderate parties who offer practical solutions rather than violent fantasies." The journalist was not stupid, merely short-sighted. He could not know that the global economy was about to collapse, that the Great Depression would destroy the stability on which the Republic depended, that the moderate parties would prove unable to address the crisis, that millions of Germans would turn to Hitler in desperation. He saw a Germany that seemed to be recovering, and he assumed the recovery would continue. The Golden Twenties ended abruptly in October 1929 when the American stock market crashed. The flow of American loans to Germany stopped immediately. American creditors called in their existing loans. German banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment soared. The prosperity that had seemed so solid evaporated almost overnight. Gustav Stresemann did not live to see the catastrophe he had worked so hard to prevent. He died on October 3, 1929, just weeks before the crash. He was only 51, worn out by years of overwork and political struggle. His death removed the Weimar Republic's most capable statesman at the moment when he was most needed. No one of comparable stature would replace him. With Stresemann gone, the foundations of the Golden Twenties collapsed. The American loans that had financed recovery were withdrawn. The international cooperation he had built broke down. The enemies of the Republic, who had been marginalized during the stable years, saw their opportunity. The Nazis, who had won only 12 Reichstag seats in 1928, would win 107 in 1930, making them the second largest party in Germany. By 1932, they would be the largest party. By 1933, they would be in power. The Weimar Republic lasted 14 years from its proclamation in 1918 to Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in 1933. In those 14 years, it faced challenges that would have strained any democracy: military defeat, revolution, political violence, economic catastrophe, and enemies determined to destroy it from both left and right. The Republic's defenders were never as passionate as its enemies. The parties that supported democracy, the Social Democrats, the Center Party, the Democrats, believed in compromise, in negotiation, in working within the system. Their enemies, the communists on the left, the Nazis and nationalists on the right, believed in struggle, in violence, in total victory. The army never accepted the Republic and would not defend it against threats from the right. The judiciary was biased, treating right-wing violence with leniency and left-wing violence with harshness. The civil service was staffed with holdovers from the Kaiser's time who had no loyalty to democratic governance. The president, after Ebert's death, was a monarchist who despised what he had sworn to protect. The economic crises, first hyperinflation, then depression, destroyed the middle class's faith in democracy. People who had worked and saved and played by the rules found themselves ruined through no fault of their own. They concluded that the system was broken, that democracy meant chaos, that only radical change could save them. They were wrong, but their desperation was real. The cultural divisions were as deep as the political and economic ones. Weimar culture, cosmopolitan, experimental, sexually liberated, was celebrated by some and despised by others. Many Germans saw the cabarets and the jazz clubs and the modern art as evidence of national decline, as proof that Germany had lost its way. They longed for a return to traditional values, to order and discipline, to a Germany they imagined had existed before the war destroyed everything. And looming over everything was the Treaty of Versailles, the stab-in-the-back myth, the war guilt clause, the territorial losses, the reparations. All of these grievances poisoned German politics. The Republic was forever associated with accepting the treaty, and no amount of success in other areas could erase that taint. Hitler built his movement on the promise of tearing up Versailles, and millions of Germans responded. The Weimar Republic was not doomed from birth. It survived the crises of its early years. It achieved a measure of stability and prosperity in the mid-1920s. Its constitution was progressive and democratic. Its culture was vibrant and creative. With different circumstances, without the Depression, without Hindenburg as president, without the Nazi movement, it might have survived and flourished. But it did not survive. It fell to enemies who exploited its weaknesses and who were more ruthless than its defenders. It fell because too many Germans had lost faith in democracy and were willing to give their loyalty to a man who promised to restore German greatness through strength and will and violence. As the 1920s ended and the 1930s began, the Weimar Republic entered its death spiral. The governments that followed Stresemann's passing were weak and ineffective, unable to address the economic crisis that was destroying millions of lives. Unemployment rose from 1.3 million in 1929 to over 6 million by 1932. Breadlines stretched around city blocks. Families were evicted from their homes. Young men, seeing no future, joined the Nazi Say or the Communist Red Front and fought each other in the streets. The political center collapsed. The moderate parties that had sustained the Republic, the Social Democrats, the Center, the Democrats, lost votes to the extremes. The Communists grew following Moscow's orders to attack the Social Democrats rather than unite against the Nazis. The Nazis grew faster, absorbing voters from all the other parties, building a coalition of the resentful and the desperate. Hindenburg, the ancient president who had never wanted democracy, ruled increasingly by emergency decree, using Article 48 to bypass the Reichstag. The chancellors he appointed, Brüning, Papen, Schleicher, were conservatives who had no popular mandate and who governed with Hindenburg's support rather than the Reichstag's confidence. Parliamentary democracy was already dying before Hitler delivered the final blow. The tragedy of Weimar was not that it failed, but that it could have succeeded. Germany in 1919 was not doomed to become Nazi Germany. There were other paths, other possibilities, other futures. But the choices made by politicians who used the Freikorps against the left, by judges who excused right-wing violence, by generals who refused to defend democracy, by voters who turned to extremism, closed off those possibilities one by one. By 1932, the Weimar Republic was a republic in name only. By 1933, it was gone entirely, replaced by Hitler's dictatorship. By 1939, Germany would be at war again, seeking to reverse the verdict of 1918 and to conquer the living space that Hitler had promised. By 1945, Germany would be in ruins, occupied by foreign armies, divided into zones, its cities reduced to rubble, its people facing a reckoning for crimes that had no parallel in human history. The Weimar tragedy led directly to the greater tragedy that followed. The failure of democracy in Germany made possible everything that came after: the Nazi dictatorship, the Holocaust, the Second World War, and the deaths of 60 million people. Understanding how Weimar failed is essential to understanding why the war happened. This is why we have spent this episode on a period that might seem distant from the battles and campaigns of the Second World War. The war did not begin in 1939. It began in 1918 with the armistice that ended the fighting but not the conflict. It continued through the 1920s as the Weimar Republic struggled to survive. It reached its culmination in 1933 when Hitler came to power and began the program he had outlined in Mein Kampf. The Weimar tragedy was not merely a German tragedy. It was a warning to all democracies about the fragility of freedom and the determination of its enemies. It showed how an economic crisis can undermine faith in democratic institutions. It showed how political violence can normalize extremism. It showed how compromises with anti-democratic forces can lead to the destruction of democracy itself. The lessons of Weimar remain relevant today. Democracies face enemies who exploit their freedoms to destroy them. Economic crises create opportunities for demagogues. The institutions of democracy must be defended or they will be lost. These lessons were written in blood in Germany between 1919 and 1933. They should not be forgotten. Next time, we will follow Germany into the darkness. We will see how Hitler consolidated his power in 1933, how he destroyed the remnants of democratic opposition, how he began the persecution of Jews that would lead to the Holocaust, and how he prepared Germany for the war of conquest he had always intended. We will see the birth of the Third Reich and the beginning of the road to the Second World War. The Weimar tragedy had ended. The greater tragedy was about to begin.